the government have the power, or legally, or is it legal or constitutional for you, the secretary, to punish a private entity for having a different viewpoint than the administration?
I don't know what you mean by punish. Can you be more specific?
Well, let's move on. Apparently, I don't want to get into this back and forth on this.
Did you catch that? A Democrat tried to trap the secretary with fake gotcha questions, and instead ended up exposing exactly how scared they are of free speech. He came in swinging, left confused, and accidentally admitted they only like diversity when everyone agrees with them. The hypocrisy in this clip is so loud it needs its own microphone. If you're ready to watch a politician talk himself into knots, hit like, subscribe, and let's watch the full clip before I give you the full breakdown.
Gentleman, and I recognize the gentleman and teacher from California, Mr. Ticano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here, Madam Secretary. Good to see you again. Let's get right to it. Madam Secretary, do you believe that the federal government is legally or constitutionally permitted to punish a private entity for having a different viewpoint than the administration?
What do you mean by that?
Well, does the government have the power, or legally, or is it legal or constitutional for you, the secretary, to punish a private entity for having a different viewpoint than the administration?
I don't know what you mean by punish. Can you be more specific?
Well, let's move on. Apparently, I don't want to get into this back and forth on this. Let me say, this poster here, you gave an interview on CNBC on May 28th, and discussing the cancellation of Harvard University's federal funding, grants, and contracts. And you said, and I quote, "Universities should continue to be able to do research as long as they're abiding by the laws and in sync, I think, with the administration and what I think the administration is trying to accomplish." So what you're saying, Harvard can have its funding and its international students back if and when it teaches what the Trump administration demands. And these demands are included in this April 11th letter signed by the Department of Education and other agencies, and include a requirement that the government must be able to, quote unquote, audit the viewpoints of its student body, faculty, staff, to ensure, quote unquote, viewpoint diversity. I ask unanimous consent to submit this letter for the record.
Without objection, it will be submitted.
And it says, I quote in the letter, quote, "Harvard must abolish all criteria, preferences, and practices through its admissions and hiring practices that function as ideological litmus tests," end quote. Now, Madam Secretary, what are the limits of this viewpoint diversity that the administration is trying to enforce? Under these demands, for example, would the Harvard government department be compelled to hire faculty that believe the 2020 election was stolen?
I believe that there are rights to freedom of speech, but on campuses and universities of colleges and universities across the country, freedom of speech should be allowed. There should be open debate. There should be different viewpoints.
But I'm not asking you a question about freedom of speech here, Madam Secretary. I'm asking you about the limits of viewpoint diversity cited in this letter. You demand that Harvard would be compelled to hire faculty. I mean, well, you're saying that there has to be viewpoint diversity. I'm just asking you, would the government department be compelled to hire faculty that believe the 2020 election was stolen? As an example of viewpoint diversity.
However, one of the things that Harvard Crimson, and by its
okay,
own,
I think you don't really have an answer, so I'm going to move on to other questions. Maybe we can clarify by other questions. Would viewpoint diversity mean, for example, Madam Secretary, reclaiming my time, reclaiming my time, Madam Secretary, the Secretary, would the Harvard Medical School, who is looking to hire an immunologist, would that person need to adhere to HHS Secretary Kennedy's view on the efficacy of vaccines?
Listen, we all know that we should have our universities look at what all the programs are.
I don't think you really thought through this viewpoint diversity issue
that you're trying to put forth is a false narrative.
Okay.
And the funding is a privilege.
Madam Secretary, reclaim my time. Does refusing to hire a Holocaust denier as a member of Harvard's history department faculty count as an ideological litmus test?
I believe that there should be diversity of viewpoints relative to teachings and opinions on campuses.
But what about this situation of Harvard's history department, and they're looking for another department member? Would being a Holocaust denier count
Well, I do know
as
that I do know that Harvard did replace its head of Middle Eastern studies even before we looked at it because they believed that they needed to make changes already.
Okay, can you explain to me how cutting funding to improve, cutting funding to cancer research, which may save the lives of children, will help Jewish students on campus?
Well, we had to put some teeth in the anti-Semitism studies, so we used, that actually didn't come from the Department of Education, that came from HHS. So therefore, Harvard had indicated that it might even take from its endowment, which is $53 billion, some funds to continue that research, and I think that might have been a really good use for some of those funds.
Well, I think it's pretty clear you haven't really thought through this whole viewpoint.
Well, you wouldn't know because you haven't allowed me to answer my questions, but thank you.
Well, I think you were showing that you couldn't really answer the questions.
The gentleman's
No.
time has expired.
I yield back.
I thank the gentleman.
That exchange right there was a disaster for the Democrats and a quiet win for the Republicans. The congressman tried to frame this like the administration is some kind of free speech dictator, but what he actually revealed is how allergic the left is to viewpoints they don't control. He wasn't asking real questions, he was fishing for headlines. And when the secretary didn't walk into his trap, he panicked and started reclaiming his time like a broken alarm clock. Let's talk about what really happened. The administration said universities should follow the law and not run ideological litmus tests. And suddenly Democrats are pretending this is tyranny. That's rich. These are the same universities that blacklist conservatives, cancel speakers, and treat half the country like intellectual contaminants. But now that someone says, hey, maybe don't discriminate based on politics, suddenly it's the end of academic freedom. And the questions, oh my goodness, pure political theater. Should Harvard hire election deniers? Should they hire Holocaust deniers? That wasn't a serious inquiry, that was a scare tactic. That's the left's favorite move. Take a basic principle like viewpoint diversity and stretch it into something absurd so they can pretend it's dangerous. Nobody said hire extremists. What the administration said is stop running campuses like ideological gated communities. Then came the emotional blackmail. What about cancer research? What about Jewish students? That was shameless. He tried to pin funding decisions on the secretary while ignoring the fact that Harvard has a $53 billion endowment with AB. If Harvard really cared about research, they could fund it themselves before lunch. The idea that the federal government is obligated to bankroll institutions that openly defy federal law is laughable. And here's the funniest part. The man accusing the administration of silencing speech literally wouldn't let the secretary finish a single answer. Not one. He cut her off every time, reclaimed his time, talked over her, and then accused her of not answering. That's not oversight, that's performance art. The secretary stayed calm, stayed factual, and kept pointing back to the same principle. Free speech, open debate, and lawful conduct. The Democrat exposed himself. He doesn't want diversity of viewpoints. He wants obedience. And that's exactly why this moment matters. One side is trying to protect free expression and fairness. The other side is terrified that their monopoly on campus ideology might finally be challenged. And judging by how rattled he sounded at the end, they know that monopoly is cracking.